Hey there everyone, Nubkeks here, and welcome back to another WoW discussion video, a bit of a theory crafting video, where I want to talk about some of the problems with talents in the game at the moment, and what I would hope could change, possibly, on the Shadowlands beta, which should be coming out this week. And also, please, cross your fingers that I get into it, because hopefully if I do, that's a creepy eye, I never noticed that before. Hopefully if I do, I'll be able to make lots of videos for you guys, showing you all the different specs and talking you through them and what's changed and the covenants, etc. I'd love to do videos like that, so hopefully. But yeah, let's talk about talents. I'm going to use Shadow Priest as the example at the start here because they have a particularly bad talent tree, and it's also a spec I know very well because I main this class in Desire Lore and in Eternal Palace. I also did, by the way, the video on problems with Shadow Priests in the Shadowlands Alpha, which is what kind of turned me onto this topic of the talents in particular, because that was something that obviously stood out as a problem, but I didn't want to dive into it in that video, hence this one. And I've got some solutions here as well for what they could do, which might be a little crazy, but we'll see, and let me know what you think. And very, very importantly, let me know how if these problems exist with your spec, and how my solutions would fit with your spec. Would they fit at all? Because it's quite possible that some specs might have actually pretty decent talent trees and could potentially lose something if you go with the semi crazy changes that I'm going to suggest. So, the talents. What are the problems with the talents? Shadow Priest is a great one to illustrate several problems. Okay, so problem number one. Let's look at the level 90 talent tier first. We have Lingering Insanity here, right? When Void Form ends, the haste bonus will fade slowly instead of ending immediately. This is numerically so strong that this is always taken, this for all of BFA, has always been taken in every single situation in PvE content, and these other two talents have simply never, ever been picked, right? So that's the first part of the problem, is that you can have a talent be so good that the other talents never get picked. The bigger part of the problem, the second half of this first problem though, is that we have Mindbender, which makes our 3-minute Shadow Fiend, or Glyph of the Voidling in this case, CD, which is a boring CD enough, but it makes it a 1-minute cooldown, so that's kind of neat, right? Your 3-minute cooldown becomes a 1-minute cooldown. But then even more importantly, we've got Void Torrent, which used to be our this used to be our artifact weapon ability, and the issue with this is look how cool this thing looks. Look how badass this ability is. It's super freaking cool. It's a 45-second cooldown. You channel, does a big chunk of damage, and it pauses your sanity drain, right? It pauses your sanity drain, and it generates sanity over the duration. So you could use this in a very real gameplay way. Towards the coming up to the very end of your Void Form, you can eke out those few extra settings and seconds in Void Form to really do some super good damage with that, which is super badass. And this is problem number one with the current talent tree, which is we have some actually genuinely very interesting abilities, and particularly this one is a super cool visually and gameplay wise ability that is never ever picked, because it just can't compete with the other things in the talent tree. So that's a big problem. This is just too strong, and you lose out on something really cool. Another problem is, let's go to row 30. Okay, so in row 30, we have Intangibility. This makes Dispersion. Dispersion is our main defensive. It's a 2-minute defensive, right? That lowers the cooldown by 30 seconds, and it makes you heal you for half your max health over the duration. It's pretty cool, and you actually do run this in PvP, right? This does get run in PvP. That's kind of nice. So, okay, make my personal defensive stronger. Then we have Sand Lane, which makes Vampiric Embrace have a shorter cooldown and does more healing. This is our sort of rage utility, our group utility, which makes our single target shadow damage heal a nearby ally. So this is super fun, and you run this very, very occasionally. But again, we have another problem here. Problem number two is Body and Soul, right? Power Word Shield increases your target's move speed by 40% for 3 seconds. The problem with this is, without this talent, Shadow Priest has literally 0 mobility. 0. We are slower than Death Knights. We are slower than Paladins. We are the slowest spec in the game, with literally 0 abilities that give us any movement whatsoever. Okay, so again, this talent, even though it's quite boring, and though it'd be quite cool, like Sand Lane is super fun to play around. It feels so much fun in a Mythic Plus when, you know, you've got a crazy pull, a difficult pull for the healer. It's so much fun when you have Sand Lane and you can go like, I'm popping, you can go in a voice and say, I'm popping Sand Lane. And then the healer goes like, wow, actually, that's quite noticeable. That actually helped a lot. That is so badass. Or just getting that burst of personal survivability and tangibility. These are super cool, but you're really prevented from taking these very often at all, just because kind of, defensive utility options are put behind a mobility option for a spec that has 0 mobility. So you get forced into this nearly all the time. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is in talent row 15 here. By the way, the only talent we ever changed, by the way, in 8.3 are these 2. Okay, just to put it in perspective, nothing else ever changes ever in PvE. Literally never. Anyway, talent 15 though, Shadowward Void is a big problem. This was our BIS legendary item in Legion. This is a mandatory PvE talent for all of BFA, and it's still there in the Shadowlands Alpha. This gives you basically 2 charges of Mind Blast instead of 1. Shadow Priest is a very simple rotation, but it's very punishing, and this makes it much less punishing. It makes the spec flow much more cleanly. Like if you imagine like Holy Paladin with 2 charges of Crusader, or any Ret Paladin as well, with 2 charges of Crusader Strike, maybe Prot Paladin, I don't know, never really played it. Or Shaman with 2 charges of Riptide or Lava Burst, for example. It's just one of those situations where you have a spell that really should be baseline just from a quality of life. It just makes the spec by a very simple change, a very baseline change, feel so much better and run so much better that it basically becomes a mandatory PvE talent. The other options here are Shadowy Insight, which is kind of cool actually. And again, you do run this one in PvP, to be fair. This is good in PvP, which makes your ticks of Shadowward Pain have a chance to make your Mind Blast cooldown reset and be instant cast. So that's kind of fun. It's a little proc thing. Or then Fortress of the Mind, which is super boring. Just your single target spells do a bit more damage and generate a bit more sanity. Actually points towards problem number 4. This is problem number 4. I'm going to add this one on, which is that you have a lot of these sort of filler talents. They're really genuinely quite boring. They're quite boring. And they're just there to kind of pad out the tree and make sure that there is stuff to choose. Like, you never even choose this. This is literally never chosen, but it's just there to fill the tree. It's boring. So there you go. They're the 4 problems. I'm curious if they are problems with your spec as well. So do you have these problems with your spec? Problem number 1 being cool abilities in the talent tree. Cool abilities that you can't ever take because they're just not viable compared to other talents. Problem number 2 being interesting like utility type talents, but you've got rows which mix different types of utility. In this case, defensive utility with mobility, and you're forced to take one particular type and can't take the other one. Problem number 3 being stuff that should really be baseline quality of life, just basic stuff that really makes your spec a lot more fun to play, which again is a talent that then it becomes mandatory. Just stuff that should really be baseline part of your class is a mandatory talent that blocks you off from other talents. And then problem number 4 being boring filler talents. If I jump over to Havoc Demon Hunter really, really fast, there's a couple of examples of this here, right? So like a First Blood, for example, makes your Blade Dance much cheaper. So this has been, again, a mandatory talent for all of BFA, and the other talents in the tier were just not taken at all. This is Shadowlands, so Essence Break is new. We'll ignore that for now. Or then Demonic at level 50. This has been nerfed in Shadowlands, which I actually think is good, because you have to sort of plan your Demonic window a bit more. But this is a talent. In fact, it's such a fun talent that they added this talent in for Vengeance Demon Hunters as well. But it makes your Eye Beam make you enter Demon form for 6 seconds. So that's super fun. It's super fun. It gives you these little burst windows to play around. In my opinion, that's sort of an example of something that's so cool that it should probably just be baseline. Just, it just makes the spec much more interesting. And then you have, like, for example, Nemesis is quite a boring talent. Momentum, somewhat slightly boring. These talents are a bit hidden away. Now, I mean, Havoc's not quite as bad as Shadow Priest. Like, all of these level 15 talents are different ways to generate Fury. They're pretty okay. Level 25, we've got a couple of different ways to generate Fury that are reasonably okay. Their defensive talent tier is actually pretty good as well, and their utility tier is pretty good. Like, you got Stun, the choice of your AoE stun, a single target stun, or slow on a charge. So on a charge-based system, that's pretty good. That's some nice variety there. Or then defensively, you've got an immunity on a cooldown. You have passive leech, more so in metamorphosis. Or then you have your core defensive is a little bit stronger. So that's a pretty good defensive tier, right? So not too bad, but there's still issues there. let me show you my proposed system, and you can let me know if it looks good or if it looks crazy. So again, this is our talent tree now, and this is what I'm proposing. Oh, hang on. This is what I'm proposing that it could look like instead. Actually, before we dive into that, obviously you got a little bit of a preview there with the major and minor. This is definitely inspired for me by the essence system. Yes, it had some flaws, but one thing I particularly enjoyed with the essences as Shadow Priest was that I would change between about 3 major essences pretty frequently. Essence of the Focusing Iris being 1.5 minute, big AoE damage cooldown. Very cool. Condensed Life Force then being a 3 minute, really single target focused essence. With a bit of cleave, you know, and a bit of a few other benefits, but mostly being a 3 minute, I want to do lots of single target damage. And then Memory of Lucid Dreams, which is particularly cool for Shadow Priest, which was a 2 minute cooldown, which doubled your sanity generation for 15 seconds. So that was really fun with Void Form. Right, super fun with Void Form, and it would let you really push that Void Form even further. With very intense gameplay, it was super cool. So again, you had like these 3 choices. Okay, 1.5 minute big AoE cooldown, a 2 minute cooldown that lets me boost my Void Form and really would up my cleave damage. So like Zakul would be a fight where that was really powerful this tier, this expansion. Or then a 3 minute big single target cooldown. And swapping between those felt really good for me. I really enjoyed that. It was cool. These major choices that you'd use for different kinds of content. So Mythic Plus, boss fights with cleave in them, or single target situation, like maybe Tyrannical Mythic Plus, very, very occasionally, or more like single target fights. Those changes, they changed a bit how you played, and they felt powerful, they felt significant. I enjoyed that. That has been an inspiration for some of these changes here. So first up, we have the major stuff, right? Let's look at that first. So we got Void Torrent. Void Torrent being there as major. And the idea with major is that these should be big abilities. They should be mostly very active abilities that look cool and that have a big impact on how you play, and that you will switch between these significantly based off different types of content. So Void Torrent, okay, a 45-second big single target damage. So that gives me, it also boosts my Void Form, so it does have use. And like Mythic Plus, you could still use it. It gives you good, a short cooldown priority damage, so you can like focus every single, pull, every big pack. You can focus down the priority target a bit more, or you can also use it to boost your Void Form a bit. So pretty cool, short cooldown. Dark Ascension, being a 1 minute cooldown, which instantly puts you into Void Form. Does a big chunk of AoE damage as well. That gives you some insanity to play with. I think that could be quite fun as like a slightly longer cooldown, but that lets you just more focus on more generic AoE. Or then Surrender to Madness has been a mess. I kind of put this in. It's a bit of a meme talent, and it's reworked constantly. But broadly speaking, I'd like to see Memory of Lucid Dreams brought in as a sort of thing. It works similar to that, where it doubles your sanity generation. In this case, it makes it double it for 1 minute. But then you take 90% of your max health as damage and can't generate insanity for 15 seconds. I think that could be okay. But broadly speaking, the idea would be that this would be more of like a bigger cooldown, a much longer cooldown that gives you a big chunk of burst, like a noticeable burst CD, but on a much longer CD. So essentially you're choosing between, okay, do I want the short burst CD for a short single target CD? That will really help me with priority and single target damage, and a bit in AoE as well. Do I want the more sort of AoE focused one and just like jump into Void Form more frequently for like world questing, for packs and Mythic Plus, for like ad spawns and a raid fight, give me that sort of AoE burst? Or do I want a much longer CD that will give me more significant, a more significant burst damage on this longer period, right? This longer window. But I'm going to be weaker, like when it's on cooldown, like maybe every 30 seconds out of 3 minutes, I'll be more powerful, but I'm going to not be as strong without these ones, right? So you're kind of swapping between them based on the needs of the different fights and the needs of what you're doing. So that's the sort of idea with the majors, right? Then we've got minors here as well, right? We've got minors. So over here, we've Shadow Crash, Misery, Dark Void. So this is really focusing on AoE for Shadow Priest, right? Misery makes our Vampiric Touch also play Shadow Word Pain. Very cool. Dark Void is awesome. It's a 30-second cooldown that does AoE damage, generates sanity, and applies Shadow Word Pain to everything nearby. So for example, this was used a lot in Reaping. You could just dot all the stuff in Reaping, all of the mobs at once. It was very cool. Or then Shadow Crash. This is very similar to Dark Void, like the 30-second cooldown generates 30 sanity, 10k damage. This is 20-second cooldown, 20 insanity, 12k damage. So they're a bit too similar for this to really quite work, but you can make this like a 15-second cooldown, so it's half the CD. You don't get the dot effect, but you're going to do more damage with it, just straight up flat damage. or it could be like a 1 minute cooldown and it does a lot more damage. You know, like they could differentiate it a little bit. But the idea is that these are more flavorful, and that yes, you will switch these a bit depending on the content. So for example, like, you know, a dungeon, for example, like King's Rest, Misery could be really good where you're pulling smaller packs. In dungeons where you're going to pull, like, let's say Shrine of the Storm with all the little blobs and stuff, Dark Void could be a lot stronger. Or maybe the blobs die too quickly, Shadow Crash could be better, you know? They're relatively minor changes, and you'll switch around a little bit, but it's not a huge deal. Same thing with this tier. You'd have Mindbender, which makes your Shadow Fiend, you know, a shorter cooldown, quite passive. Shadowy Insight, you're just going to proc some random Mind Blast, so a little bit of a proc thing. Or Twist of Fate, which is, you know, just you have a little bit more execute damage. So relatively passive, relatively minor, but kind of a nice little bit of flavor. And then Utility, here's a big thing. We're not going to... last word should really be default, right? So you'd have a single target stun, make your AoE Fear centered on you be a AoE Disorient with a 30-yard range, cool. Or then Void Shift. This was just a fun example of, I thought, a cool spell that could be Utility, which is a big cooldown that makes you swap health percentage with a party member. So that's like a big, you know, saving cooldown. So it's a little bit stands out there, so maybe that doesn't quite work, but just, you know, a little bit more interesting Utility tier, perhaps. Or then for the defensives here, again, this is one of the core things. This is a survivability tier. Instead of having your only mobility thing, just bake this in baseline or give Angelic Feather baseline, and then make your big cooldown stronger, give your raid cooldown more power, or Greater Fade, which is a PvP talent, which makes your Fade give you some move speed, and it's a very short minor immunity with a lot of caveats, right? But yeah, just give you an extra sort of little defensive button. I also believe that Desperate Prayer, which is the defensive for Holy and Disc Priest, is actually coming to Shadow Priest in Shadowlands. So perhaps they could just boost that instead. But that gives you the rough idea. If I jump over to Holy Priest really fast, you see a similar sort of thing, right? So major things. Okay, Holy Word Salvation, big raid cooldown. Apotheosis. This is like, again, a big enough cooldown on a longer duration that's really going to boost your throughput to a higher level for a moderate amount of time. It's a little bit weak as a cooldown, but you get the idea, sort of how it would fit in here. Or then Spirit of the Redeemer, which is actually a PvP talent, which lets you go into this invulnerable spirit mode, which normally activates for Holy Priest when they die, makes it an active ability instead, that you go invulnerable and you could just sort of free cast spells at no mana cost and be invulnerable. So that would feel super good for like Mythic Plus, for example. Like I go Apotheosis, be like, okay, I want to have really, really higher throughput for a long period of time. I want the big burst raid CD, or I want this where I can go invulnerable. You know, like it feels very good as a Holy Paladin, for example. When shit goes down in Mythic Plus, you could pop D Shield and just be like, I'm just going to heal. I don't need to worry. That sort of thing could be quite fun. And Holy Priest needs a lot of love for Mythic Plus, right? Or then Minor, Halo being a big raid AoE healing, Divine Star being sort of smaller group healing, and then Greater Heal for some single target healing. Again, might not quite translate over perfectly, but you get the idea. Then minor stuff here being, you know, Flash of Light procs, a bit more AoE for free. Binding Heal sort of replaces Flash of Light, makes it cleave a bit more. Or Prayer Circle, which is a new talent, pretty cool. Makes Circle of Healing, make your Prayer of Healing, which is your AoE heal, your standard AoE heal, cast faster. So just generally upping some group healing in a fairly small way. And then again, utility stuff. So like AoE knockback, better AoE fear, single target stun, right? Survivability, boosting up your main survivability in Desperate Prayer, the Greater Fade thing, which I talked about before, or then Concentration, which is going to give you immunity to interrupts and silences and knockbacks. Again, usefully in niche circumstances for sure in Mythic Plus. It is a PvP talent. It could be useful in some raid fights, that sort of thing. But you get sort of the idea here that by squashing the talent tree from 7 rows, with cool talents being locked away behind things, with talent tiers, which, you know, are trying to do different things and therefore lock things out, with really boring filler talents that we can, and with stuff that should really be baseline as well, by making things baseline, it could work a lot better. Again, with Demon Hunter, this is sort of a thing I came up with for Demon Hunter. So we got like minor, these all generate more fury. Over here, again, this makes I-Beam last longer. This makes your Blade Dash, Fell Rush give you a bit more damage. So it turns that to sort of semi-offensive cooldown. This one would boost your Immolation Aura. So all kind of giving you a bit more AoE boosting sort of damage, right? And then you'd have major things like Fell Barrage is a 1 minute big AoE bursts cooldown. Essence Break is new. It's a 20-second, more single target and a little bit of cleave, focus burst cooldown. And then Unbound Chaos, which makes your Fell Rush make this big demon burst out of you and do some cleave damage. quite passive. That one, maybe. I struggled a bit for majors for Demon Hunter while doing this up, right? But you get the idea. So again, big major choices. So single target fight, I'm going to go probably for Essence Break. Maybe Unbound Chaos, though, if there's a little bit of cleave. If I want some more AoE focus, I can go Fel Barrage. I'm kind of really changing those up a lot, and these ones being quite a bit more passive and maybe a bit more gear dependent. You'll choose ones depending on your gear, that sort of thing. And then utility row, and then a really survivability focused row. Holy Paladin was a little bit of a struggle, where they actually have a pretty good talent tree, where they have lots of cool talents, so this is a bit more tricky, but you get some of those sort of ideas. I'm very curious what you think with your talent trees. How does it work for your spec? All I want to convince you of in this video is I think this is quite doable for Shadowlands. I think it's possible. This is not as like a super crazy change where they couldn't do this, where like they go like, oh, this is too much of a change, this is just impossible. I think it's unlikely now we're going into beta, but there is still a chance, especially with the level squish, that they could simply do a talent tree squish and get rid of a lot of the filler, make some stuff baseline that really should be baseline. Like the unpruning is supposed to be a feature of Shadowlands. They can do that with talents as well, make stuff baseline that should be. And then make your talent tree a bit more focused on interesting choices. So for like stuff like, demonic should just be baseline, for example, there. I forgot to say that, I think. But yeah, that's sort of my idea. Would it work with your spec? Would your spec be better for this? Could you squish your talent tree down into smaller talent tiers? Would it make for more interesting choices? I'm curious to know what you think. For me, like I said, most of the specs I've played, yes, it would. It genuinely would make those more interesting, and it would be better. But I'm curious what you think. And yeah, we'll see. We'll see. You never know. It could happen. And it would be, I think, a pleasant change if it did. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope that you found that interesting, and I'm very curious to hear your feedback. And I will see you next time, hopefully on the beta, to check out more Shadowlands stuff. See you all then. Bye-bye.